2026 has been the year of Illinois, and that severe weather threat is not stopping today as more severe weather is coming to the Midwest and other populated areas of the United States today. It's going to bring the risk for all hazards of severe weather, including 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts, a couple of large to very large hailstones, and perhaps a few tornadoes back towards northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. There's also going to be a fire weather risk towards the tri-state region of Oregon, California, and Nevada over the next 2 days. But all this severe weather here on Friday is going to precede a little bit of a calmer weekend for Saturday and Sunday in terms of severe weather. So hopefully that'll be a little bit of a nice relief. In general, there's a lot to talk about today. So let's get right into the forecast. Hopping right into our day one categorical outlook, we've got a 2 out of 5 slight risk for 3 different areas in the U.S. One of those is going to be back from the Black Hills all the way back down through northern Kansas and all of central and most of eastern Nebraska. And then we've got another area of concern that's going to be back towards the Chicago and Milwaukee area throughout central Illinois and even up to central eastern Wisconsin. And then we have another area that's going to be back towards the Carolinas, where we're looking at a little bit more of an isolated wind threat. The Storm Prediction Center has issued a 2% tornado risk for Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago, even all the way back down through parts of central Illinois. But I will say the NATOcast and StormNet have been sniffing out a little bit more of an active tornado day today. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. I do think that the probability is going to be somewhat low. I think the 2% is probably pretty fair here, but it's possible that at the 11 a.m. update that we get an upgrade to a 5% risk. Wind is going to be our number one hazard today. A lot of areas are going to include some type of wind risk today with a 5% that's going to stretch all the way from close to Dallas through Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, through Georgia, even parts of the Florida Panhandle, and then back up to the Carolinas through Virginia. So a very large area there. And then that 15% in yellow for the Carolinas themselves. Then we have another 15% that's going to be back towards the Midwest around Chicago, central Illinois, and up through Milwaukee. And then we have our other 15%, which does include a SIG 1 hatched region back towards Kansas and Nebraska. So that's going to be the number one area, even up towards the Badlands there in South Dakota. So a couple of areas where some stronger, gustier winds could be possible on the order of maybe 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts at times. Isolated instances of large to very large hail are going to be possible as well, especially back from the Black Hills, again, all the way down through Nebraska. And then you're going to see that 15% there in yellow as well. And then we have another 15% that's going to include the central Illinois and southern Wisconsin areas. And then a little bit of isolated hail being possible if any clusters can remain a little bit more organized back towards the Carolinas. But I do think it's pretty unlikely. All right, here's a look at what things might look like throughout your day today on Friday. You're going to see scattered showers and storms towards the Carolinas and the Midwest, back towards maybe Milwaukee throughout the early afternoon and even the morning hours. But it's really around 4 p.m. where things really start to get going with a lot of thunderstorm development down in the southeast. And that will continue through southern Mississippi, Louisiana, and even towards eastern Texas, southeastern Texas as we get into the later afternoon hours. But by 5 p.m. here, you're going to see potentially some discrete supercells closer to Milwaukee, Madison, Rockford, Chicago type of area in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And that's where that tornado threat really could persist in the early evening hours. So that will continue from 5 p.m. to maybe around 7 or 8 p.m. before those storms begin to cluster up a little bit. And then in the later on afternoon and early evening hours, you're going to see storms potentially firing off all the way from the Badlands down towards Kansas City. So that is going to be another area to watch. And it's really later on in the evening in that area, we're going to see some greater clustering beginning to form in central Nebraska. And that's where that robust wind threat is really going to begin to occur, with potentially 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts with any storms that can really remain organized and clustered in that environment. But storms that remain discrete in that environment, such as ones you're seeing closer to the Nebraska Panhandle or just ahead of that main cluster, those ones could pose that risk for some very large hailstones, potentially upwards of tennis ball sized hailstones. So definitely something to pay attention to in isolated instances if you're out there in Nebraska. All right, Friday's severe weather and our severe weather, even as we go forward into the weekend, is going to be brought to you by the trough that's going on in the Great Lakes and, of course, our persistent high pressure over the Four Corners states that has existed for a while. It's going to promote that flow from northwest to southeast at the upper levels in our jet stream here, and that's going to create a more favorable environment for severe weather back towards the Central Plains, even the Northern Plains, and then into the Midwest. Potentially even some other severe weather could be possible in the Northeast later on in the weekend. But you're going to notice that there isn't a lot of upper level support in the Southeast, and that's going to be something that'll play a role for us here. Looking at our 500 millibar winds, you're going to notice a lack of support is going to be in place, again, back towards the Southeast, and that's going to be another limiting factor with our severe weather. It's mostly just due to a lack of divergence aloft here. So at 500 millibars, you are going to see a lot of divergence is going to be present in areas like Nebraska, and even back towards the Midwest, closer to Chicago later on in the afternoon and evening here. You're going to see some more of that divergence is going to creep in towards the Midwest, and that's going to help support that severe weather environment out there. But towards Nebraska is definitely going to be the most organized convection that we might see in the most robust clustering of our storms. Something else worth putting a quick eye to is that our low-level jet is going to begin to increase towards the Midwest at around only 8 p.m. here. So any discrete supercells that might persist still in the environment at that hour will definitely have that increased risk for a later on tornado potential if, again, any discrete cells can persist in that environment, but that is all to be determined. And then that low-level jet will continue to uptick back towards Nebraska as well, which will aid with any of those larger clusters that do persist in that environment as well. There is going to be a decent bit of wind shear available to us tonight out towards the Midwest and the Central Plains. You're going to see plenty of shear towards Nebraska and even towards the Black Hills or the Badlands of South Dakota, even down towards Kansas City as well. And then enough shear will be present towards Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Rockford type of area. So again, there will be enough upper level support to support that tornado environment down there, but not a lot of shear will be in place throughout the Southeast. And that's going to limit, again, any type of a hail threat or any type of a robust supercell threat down in the Southeast. These are just your normal summertime pop-up storms, and we're going to get a ton of them today, as we have pretty much every day. It's in fact storming outside here in Starkville, Mississippi right now as I'm filming this morning. There will be plenty of instability to go around this afternoon. You're going to see a lot of instability will be present in the Southeast. That's going to be driving our severe thunderstorm threat out there, and then plenty of instability back in our main areas of concern all the way from the Midwest and then down through Nebraska and even towards the Badlands. Now, one thing that's interesting for today is that there is going to be a decent amount of that 0 to 3 kilometer storm relative felicity, which is just how much spin can an updraft ingest within the lowest 3 kilometers of the atmosphere. But for this environment, we need a lot specifically in 0 to 1 kilometer, and we don't have a ton back towards Nebraska. And I think that's really going to limit the tornado potential out there. But we do have plenty back towards northern Illinois, maybe even southern Wisconsin. And so that is why that tornado risk is going to exist and persist with any organized storms that can remain discrete out there. Our LCL heights are not going to be particularly low as we go into the afternoon and evening towards Nebraska. There will be some areas that you can see that little blue swath in there where maybe you can get a more surface-based storm, but this is mostly going to limit our tornado potential out there. It would take kind of a miracle or an accident to get a tornado in that environment, but you will see back towards Milwaukee and even down towards Davenport, and of course, towards Chicago, you are going to have more of those blues and grays seeping in there where you can get a more surface-based storm. So essentially what this means is that the cloud deck height is going to be closer to the ground, which makes it easier to stretch a vortex from the cloud deck down to the surface and get a tornado as a result. So that's why that environment will be a little bit more favorable. And all of that is going to be driven by our massive amounts of moisture at the surface. You're going to notice as we get into the later evening hours here, even, you're going to have tons of moisture present throughout large areas in the United States here. Dew points well into the 70s in some areas. Those are the purples that you're seeing showing up on the map. So a lot of moisture, and that's going to really aid in getting those storms more surface-based back into the Midwest, especially. As we go into Saturday, that trough I mentioned over the Great Lakes is going to dig itself down towards the Ohio Valley, and that's going to promote a little bit more of a severe weather threat down in that neck of the woods. We're going to have other areas into Arkansas and then eastern Colorado, eastern Wyoming even, and the Nebraska Panhandle towards Rapid City in South Dakota as well, and then back towards Idaho and Montana. Just a bunch of different areas where we could see a little bit of a severe weather threat, but not looking at anything major for Saturday by any stretch. All 4 of those marginal risk zones are going to include a 5% risk for some wind damage. And again, not anything super significant tomorrow, but still something to pay attention to. And then finally, that hail outlook is going to include just a 5% down in Arkansas and another one back towards the Ohio Valley. I'm not thinking we're going to have a lot of hail damage tomorrow, but it is possible we could see some isolated larger hailstones on the order of maybe golf ball size. That could cause some problems. Not anything super significant. And it's also possible maybe in northeastern Colorado or eastern Wyoming, maybe the Nebraska Panhandle, or even back towards Idaho or western Montana, that we could see a couple of isolated larger hailstones. But again, Saturday's severe weather outlook is definitely not looking super significant by any stretch. So as we come out of Friday night, those storms are going to continue down through Kansas. And then eventually by Saturday early afternoon, we're going to see new thunderstorm development for a bunch of areas. And that's all driven by this low pressure system at the surface over the Great Lakes. That's going to be promoting that thunderstorm risk, just kind of sweeping across down towards the East Coast. And then you're going to see more storms firing off back towards eastern Wyoming and northeastern Colorado, the Nebraska Panhandle as well. And then even back towards western Montana and Idaho. So again, something that we still have to pay attention to as we go forward forward in time towards Saturday night. Even more storms will persist. And again, any of those storms could pose that microbursting risk or the risk for just some isolated wind damages or hailstones. It'll be something to pay attention to for Saturday, but not a major concern for a severe weather threat. But otherwise, a little bit of rain on your parade if you were looking to be in the pool on Saturday, as we'll have scattered thunderstorm development for basically the entire country, not literally the entire country, but a lot of the entire country. We'll see scattered thunderstorms for Saturday. And again, all of that's going to be driven by this trough in the upper levels. That's going to shift from over the Great Lakes and then a little bit closer towards over the Ohio Valley over time here. You're going to see just moving just a little bit to the east, and that's going to provide that shift in our weather and continue driving it as we go forward into Saturday. This is by the afternoon on Saturday, and you can see it really starting to take on maybe just a little bit of a negative tilt here as it starts to move on into the late hours on Saturday, into the early hours on Sunday as well. And again, in our forecast period, as we roll into Saturday, you're going to notice just a collapse in our wind shear. We're just not going to have a very favorable vertical wind shear profile. Maybe towards the Nebraska Panhandle and maybe towards western Montana and Idaho, we could see a little bit of thunderstorm development that is able to sustain itself for more than like 40 minutes because you'll be able to separate your updrafts from your downdrafts. That's what wind shear helps a storm do. But you're going to notice in the entire eastern half of the country, that's not really going to happen. We're not going to have a lot of wind shear present. And so that's really going to limit the amount of thunderstorm growth that we could have that could turn into a more robust severe weather environment. We're just not going to be able to see that for Saturday, which is of course good news. But we're going to still see a lot of those pop-up storms that just quickly pop up and collapse. Now on Saturday and even into Sunday, it's still going to be hot out, but one thing you'll notice is that you're going to get a little bit of a relief from that humidity, even by Saturday afternoon here. A lot of areas in the center parts of the country not going to be dealing with nearly as much relative humidity. Still going to be pretty moist back towards the mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, even of course down into Florida where it is always muggy. But in areas like Mississippi and Louisiana, a little bit of relief might be provided. So that'll be a nice relief for your Saturday. Might be a pretty nice weekend in general. And on that note, take a look at Sunday. You're going to be looking at just two areas with a marginal risk on your day 3 outlook, one back towards New York City and another one in central Montana. So again, not a lot of severe weather this weekend. That's going to be the good news. But unfortunately, Friday, we're going to have to get through some severe weather first. One other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a little bit of a fire weather risk towards the Pacific Northwest. You're going to see that elevated risk near the tri-state region of Oregon, California, and Nevada, and then some isolated dry thunderstorms possible in the Pacific Northwest as well. And then finally, there is going to be a critical fire weather risk on Saturday near the tri-state region again of California, Oregon, and Nevada, with a larger risk for isolated dry thunderstorms and even a larger elevated risk for fire weather that's going to stretch all the way up into Washington and include some parts of Idaho as well. And that's going to take us to the end of today's forecast. We will be going live tonight, which is Friday night, and then we have Met Monday coming up again on Monday. So definitely make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so that you can stay weather aware and so that you don't miss what's coming on Met Monday. We're going to have another very special guest, and I can't wait to share that with you guys. So make sure that you're following us on all platforms so that you know when that special guest drops. But otherwise, stay safe out there, and we will see you soon.